Hello, welcome to Stars, Cells, and God, the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science that have theological and philosophical implications, as well as discoveries that point to God's existence. My name is Jeff Zweerink. I'll be your guide today as we talk about DNA design and a cognitive bias. But before we get into that discussion, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our Reasons to Believe channel so that you can be notified of new weekly videos. Learn more at reasons.org or by following us on social media at RTB_official. Fuzz, good to have you in the studio today.
Jeff?
So I'll let you talk about DNA design in a few minutes, but I wanted to kind of start off our discussion talking about a cognitive bias that I became aware of and I thought was very fascinating. And I actually heard about this from Mark Perez, so I can't claim credit for having come across this research on my own. But I know you've got a sibling, so I'm going to ask you a question, put you on the spot a little bit here. Who'd your parents favor, you or your sibling?
Well, probably my brother.
Probably your brother.
Yeah.
You know that if I were, according to the study here, if I were to ask your brother, whether he's older or younger, it doesn't matter. He would say it was you that they favored. And what's fascinating, I'll just give a little bit of a background story. I have an older brother and a younger brother, and we got up into adulthood. And my parents, I know they talked a lot about treating us fairly. But we were sitting around talking with my brothers, and somehow the topic of who got favored, because I always know there were 10 years between my older and younger, and so my younger brother would push buttons at my older brother, and my older brother would respond back and forth, and so they'd go back and forth. But we were sitting around discussing about who did Dad like better, and it was funny because my older brother thought Dad liked my younger brother better. My younger brother thought Dad liked me better, and I thought Dad liked my older brother better. It was like all three of us were thought, oh, no, it's somebody else. And what I find fascinating is that this study actually helps explain why we tend to think that. That's not a Zweerink thing or a Rana thing. It's a cognitive bias we have. And the bottom line is this, that we are more prone, more likely to recognize the challenges and obstacles that we have faced and assume that other people haven't seen them. So we see the obstacles we face and we see the benefits and blessings other people get. And we have this bias that recognizes those two things. And so we always tend to think that it's been unfair to us. And what's this paper, it was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It's called the Headwinds, Tailwinds, Asymmetry, and availability bias in assessments of barriers and blessings. And what they did was they went through and set up 7 different experiments to explore this recognition that people tend to notice the hardships more and in themselves and the blessings that other people receive. To see, is that what accounts for that? Is that really going on, or to try and get an understanding of it? And one of the things they recognized or have aware is that very often, just in your own life, you'll recognize the barriers because those are things that you've had to overcome. And you're going to talk about how hard the things have been because it kind of makes you sound a little better, makes you appreciate where you are. There's this long history of literature that recognizes that. But really what they were looking at is to say, is there something more there rather than just trying to self-aggrandize or to tell a story to get more sympathy or to get things of that nature. Mm-hmm. And so they designed 7 different studies. And one of the first studies they did was to get a group of people together, conservatives and liberals, and to ask them about the Electoral College, about fundraising, about issues in trying to get Congress to cooperate with the president. And if you go to the first slide there, this is their results they found, and it's a little hard to read this, but if you notice there, the Democrats, the darker color, the Republicans, the lighter gray, Republican on the right, Democrat on the left, liberal on the left, conservative on the right, independents in the middle. And what's interesting is you look there, who has the harder time due to the Electoral College system? That all of the Republicans thought the Democrats had an easier time, and the Democrats thought the Republicans had an easier time. And and this is people that identified liberal or by Democrat, Republican. They did the same thing, identifying liberal and conservative, and found this same asymmetry there. That asymmetry persisted. Who has the harder time financing campaigns? Again, same thing. Democrats thought Republicans had the easier time. Republicans thought Democrats had the harder time. And it was pervasive across all of these systems here. Now, it can't be the case that Republicans and Democrats have a harder time. Both, there's got
right.
we're just missing something there. Right. And so what this study showed is that, again, there's this recognition there's this bias that the other side, your side is always perceiving the other side as having a harder thing. Now, there was a aspect of who wins and who loses in this. And so what they did is design another study where they went and looked at professional, or I think I'm almost positive it was the NFL, looked at difficulty of schedules. And so this wasn't, where we're looking up, the season's about to start and people are getting invested. What they did was looked at it, a few weeks out where people were just looking and asking whose schedules were harder or not. And what was interesting is that virtually every person identified their team as having the tougher schedule. And it didn't matter whether your team had a good year in the past. So if you'd had more than 9 wins, you still thought you had the harder schedule. If your team had a bad year, in the less than 9 wins, you still thought your team had the harder schedule than what was going on out there. And again, it's recognizing is there's this something about the way people are perceiving doesn't accurately reflect what's there. And going back to the discussion about the political, one thing they found is that you'd think, okay, maybe if people had studied harder, were more invested, knew what was going on, that this asymmetry would disappear because they recognize more of the process and how it works on. It turns out it's actually the reverse, that the less invested people are, the less this asymmetry shows up. The more invested people are, the more the asymmetry shows up. And again, I think the contention is, and the argument of the paper, is that the more invested you are, the more you're aware of the barriers that come up, and the more you tend to dismiss the blessings you have. You see the struggle or whatever, and it just always shows up as the other side has it easier, we've had it harder. And they actually looked at siblings as well. They took a whole survey, another study where they looked at siblings. And they restricted it to just 2 siblings because there's a whole lot more dynamics. And again, they found that same asymmetry. And just study after study after study, they did 7 different studies, and they all show this asymmetry. In fact, I'll show another one here. This is where they did a test where people just had to perform a set of tasks. And in one time, so it was an even number of tasks, but there were harder tasks and easier tasks. And in one time, the green tasks were easier and the blue tasks were harder. And in the other group, the green tasks were harder and the blue tasks were easier. And again, they went through and then they went back and had people say, okay, how many of the tasks were blue? And what they found is that where in the blue headwind condition, everybody identified that there were more blue tasks because those were the harder than green. And in the green, the same thing. Everybody recognized the barriers far more readily than the easy tasks. And they even did that when, when they were going to recall questions over different things. One more. Go to the next results of the next study. This is the study where they did a trivia contest where they had 5 easy categories, 5 hard categories for each team. And both teams saw the categories ahead of time. So they knew what categories they were facing. I forget whether they knew what the other ones were facing, but they knew what they were seeing. They went through, did the competition, and then they went back and asked the question to have them recall the categories that were theirs.
Yeah.
And you can see there that the easy ones, everybody had a pretty good time recalling the easy ones, even from their own and for their art. But for the difficult ones, everybody could remember their own difficult ones, but didn't remember the difficult ones for their opponents. And not just even having to recall, if you go to the next one, when they just did it, so they listed them all up there, showed them, so where you could just recognize the categories. So this one, you had to remember the categories, write them down. This one, here were all the categories, just choose which had which. And again, even having all of the categories out there, that asymmetry still persists. There's this tendency to remember the challenges and difficulties you face, the barriers, and not remember the benefits you have. So I think, in these 7 or 6 of the 7 different categories they went through, and I think pretty clearly demonstrated that people will remember what comes to mind when they think about something are the challenges and difficulties, and they fail to remember the blessings and benefits that have gotten them there. The one that I thought was the most informative that I wanted to talked about today was one where they were looking at accountants. And, apparently there's an experimental and a non-experimental accountant that you can have, and it's beyond my ability to describe those. But what they did was to ask the accountants how they're doing, and professor, in terms of being able to write grants, get their grants funded, get professorships, get tenure, those sorts of things, looking at all of that. And they found that whether you're an experimental or non-experimental accountant, that both people saw the challenges being about the same amount. That there wasn't an asymmetry there. But what they found was that as the perceived level of challenges and hardship went up, that increasing perception of hardness and barriers corresponded with a willingness to engage in morally questionable behavior. So there was no difference in what they thought morally questionable behavior was. And this takes it out of the I just want to make things seem harder or easier in terms of characterizing yourself. This was something where they wanted to test, does this have a consequence for how people act? And what they found was that the harder something is, the more you perceive that things are unfair, you've had more barriers, more obstacles to overcome. Statistically speaking, the more likely you are to engage in morally questionable behavior so that you can level the playing field.
Yeah. So you feel like that immoral behavior is justified, it's warranted, because you got the short end of the stick.
That's what it kind of it came across as, because it wasn't experimental accounting was a newer field that you could argue it's harder to get in, harder to get, there's lots of things going on there, and it didn't matter whether you're an experimental or non-experimental accountant, whether as to the questionable behavior. So you might think, okay, everybody in the experimental accountant behavior thinks, okay, this is a harder field, we got to get it established. No, it wasn't that. It was the perceived level of the barriers you faced was what determined whether you were more open to morally questionable behavior or not. And I thought that was interesting from 2 perspectives. One is I've just been thinking about, or recognizing and reading and talking about how we are dealing with racial and gender and stuff, particularly in science and how we teach it. And I don't want to spend much time on that. There's another discovery I want to talk to that relates to that. But that whole mindset is kind of emphasizing the barriers that we're facing, which if we're already inclined to notice the barriers and increasing the perception of increased barriers leads to moral questionable behavior, we want to be careful how we deal with that. And I think that's something we need to think about. How do we actually address and deal with things that have been wrong and perceived injustices? How do we do that? What I found interesting, I'll just kind of in briefly passing mention that people have looked at how to deal with this sense of fairness, and what they found is that where there's been unfairness or justice or perceived level injustice, people who have benefited from that don't really benefit much from being pointed out how things are fair. But where things have been corrected and things have been fair, where there's this perceived injustice, as you've been pointing out how the playing field has been leveled, that actually leads to more positive and healthy outcomes. And so if we're doing something that emphasizes and perpetuates a sense of injustice that doesn't exist now, even if it did in the past, we may be making the problem worse rather than pointing out, if I get what this other study's saying, by pointing out how things are fair, that actually helps people come to better outcomes. And so this is, again, how do we go about doing this? And why I bring all this up is because when you look at how Christianity has, throughout its message, what its message is, I was just reminded of this passage from 1 Thessalonians. It says 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. It says, "Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." That in the discussion of this headwinds, tailwinds asymmetry, what the authors were pointing out is that gratitude is a key component to having a healthy outcome, to feeling healthy, happy, enjoying life. And this headwinds, tailwinds asymmetry, where we tend to notice the barriers instead of the blessings, removes gratitude. And here you have Christianity saying, hey, don't pay attention to the circumstances. Whatever circumstance you're in, pray, rejoice, be thankful, because God is still with you there. And I think I think it's a message of great hope, because if my happiness was contingent upon the circumstances I was in, my happiness or my joy in life is always driven by somebody beyond me. That is a helpless, hopeless feeling. Whereas what God is saying through Paul in his letter to the Thessalonians is, no, if you focus on who God is and give thanks and rejoice, that will bring that joy to you. And we see evidence of that in our studies of humanity. What the end of the paper, the authors recognize two things. One is that by focusing on the barriers, you undermine a grateful attitude, which leads to a worse outcome. But the flip side of that, we tend to, if you've had a lot of, there are just a lot of barriers. I mean, there's been, throughout human history and even in American history, there's just been a lot of people who've taken advantage of. There's things that I've struggled with here. I can focus on those. I'm easy to recognize those. But God says, no, let's do something else. Instead of being resentful, let's have an attitude of gratitude. In fact, I loved, he had a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. He said, noted in his Eco Homo, "Nothing consumes a man more quickly than resentment." Well, if we're inclined to notice our barriers, that will build resentment. What's the remedy? Well, gratitude is the remedy to building resentment. The flip side of that is that people who've benefited from those injustices often count their accomplishments as the work they've done rather than the blessings they've received. I am keenly aware. I remember when I was in high school and even into college, I'm like, wow, look how well I've done, because God has blessed me with a pretty analytical, careful, with a mind that can do certain things that are valued in school well. I took credit for what I had been blessed with. I mean, I worked hard at it, don't get me wrong. But I'm taking credit for something that I was essentially given and not recognizing it as a blessing. Even getting through graduate school, the blessings from my families and the support and encouragement that have come there were critical to that. And I've learned to appreciate that more, which helps me live better in life. And so the things that I found fascinating and were intriguing is that I think this points to the truth of Christianity, that God tells us to rejoice and be grateful in all circumstances. Don't focus on the barriers. Don't focus on the hindrances. Work and overcome them, but don't let those consume you, because that will lead to resentment and a very, very unhealthy outcome for you. So the way to live life well is to live it the way God has told us, because He's the one who knows and designed us. And we see evidence of that in the scientific literature.
Yeah, that's great stuff, Jeff. Thanks.
You're welcome. So I think you have some stuff on DNA design. So rather than looking at the design of people, let's look at, the design of people.
Yeah. Well, to kind of help us have a proper frame of reference for the discovery I want to talk about, I don't know if you ever saw the movie Gremlins. Have you?
I've seen bits and pieces, but not the whole movie.
Well, actually, this movie was released in the summer of 1984. So I was dating my wife at the time, and we went to see Gremlins. And so kind of a horror comedy classic. And, the premise of the movie is that this teenager named Billy Peltzer, I think, receives a mogwai from his father as a gift. And his father purchases this creature from an antique dealer in Chinatown. And there's like 3, rules. I don't know if you remember this, but, don't expose it to light because the light will kill the mogwai.
Okay.
The second one was don't get it wet.
Okay.
And then the third one was don't feed it after midnight.
Okay.
3 very important rules. And of course, the mogwai that Billy receives is a cute little creature that he nicknames Gizmo. And one of his friends is messing around, and he gets water on Gizmo.
Oh, no.
And then 3 more or 4 or 5 more little Gizmos are spawned, right? Little mogwais are spawned. But these are a lot more mischievous. And they trick Billy into feeding them after midnight.
Okay.
And they wind up forming a cocoon, and then out hatches this reptilian type of creature called a gremlin that wreaks all kinds of havoc on the town, right?
Okay.
Stripe is the villain, and he goes to the YMCA and gets in the pool and, spawns more gremlins. But the point here is that, there's this creature that can exist in 2 forms. One is a sweet,
right.
Harmless form, and the other one is an evil, malevolent form.
Okay.
And that actually is true when it comes to the nucleobases that are found in DNA. And there are 4 nucleobases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. And they can actually exist in 2 different chemical forms. And those 2 forms are called tautomers. And they can interconvert one to the other, one tautomeric form to the other. And it turns out that one tautomeric form is like Gizmo.
Okay.
It's really beneficial and helpful for the structure of DNA. And the other one is kind of like a gremlin. It causes all kinds of problems in DNA.
All
in
right.
fact, contributes to spontaneous mutations that take place in DNA during DNA replication. And there was a paper that was published actually in 2002. So this isn't actually a new discovery, but it was new to me because as I was looking in the scientific literature for something completely different,
All right.
this paper popped up. And it's work done by a scientist at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. And in fact, I was aware of some of his other work and wrote about it in both the Cells Design and Fit for a Purpose. But he actually shows that when it comes to the tautomers in DNA, it could be far worse, that the 4 nucleobases in DNA have the special property of having minimal consequences from tautomerism compared to other potential nucleobases that could have been used in DNA, so that the set of bases in DNA has been optimized for again, minimizing the harmful effects of tautomerization.
So I'm gathering that making tautomers is part of the there's some level of that happens no matter how pristine the system. And
yes.
So
yeah.
the recognition is the DNA base pairs that we have, the level of the consequences of that are pretty minimal.
Right.
Compared to other forms or other bases.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Okay.
It could be a lot worse. So just a little bit of background, and then we can talk a little bit about the work that he did. And this is a diagram showing the structure of a nucleotide. So the nucleotides are the building block units that make up DNA, and there are 4 nucleotides that are defined by the nucleobase: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. And so this is a cartoon showing the nucleobase cytosine, and it consists of a sugar called a deoxyribose sugar. It's a 5-carbon sugar that will cyclize to form a 5-membered ring. And attached to one of the OH groups is a phosphate functional group, and the other to the nucleobase. To the OH group in the number 1 position, the nucleobase is attached. And here, again, it's cytosine. And then what ends up happening is that in order to form DNA, the nucleotides will react with each other to form this linear chain where the phosphate groups form a bridge between the sugars of the sequential nucleotide subunits.
Right.
And then the nucleobases extend kind of as a side group. And there are two different polynucleotide strands that come together, and they interact to form like a ladder architecture where the backbone is like the uprights, the side groups are like the rungs of the ladder. And you always have a very special set of pairing of the two strands where adenine from one strand always pairs with thymine on the other, guanine always pairs with cytosine. You can see that in the diagram. The adenine and guanine are purines. They consist of a fused 5-membered ring and a 6-membered ring. And then the pyrimidines, which are thymine and cytosine, are 6-membered rings. And so the distance between the strands is always the same.
Right.
And the interaction between the two strands is is driven by hydrogen bonding interactions, where there's very specific hydrogen bonding interactions. So the adenine in one strand always pairs with thymine on the other. Again, guanine with cytosine.
I have to say, I don't know why it just struck me as now, these are very complex and elegant molecules.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you think of, you got this, just look at the magenta ones there. It's like they're providing this backbone between the area. They're part of this backbone as well as the bridge. It's like, that's just an impressive looking molecule.
It is, very much. And then if you twist it, you get the well-known DNA double helix. But what's most important today for us is, again, this interaction between thymine and adenine and guanine and cytosine. And it's the interaction is mediated by these highly specific hydrogen bonding interactions between the different atoms of thymine and adenine and guanine and cytosine. Now, when it comes to this phenomena of tautomerization, all right, this is an example of a tautomerization reaction. And this is if somebody takes organic chemistry and you take the second semester of organic chemistry as an undergraduate, you'll learn about this interconversion. And so this is a molecule of acetone. And on the left-hand side is what's called the keto tautomer. And on the right-hand side is called the enol tautomer. And so what ends up happening formally is that a hydrogen from the carbon bound to the carbonyl, that's the methyl group, one of the hydrogens from that methyl group will migrate to the oxygen. And then as a result of that, the double bond between the carbon and the oxygen will switch with the single bond between the two carbons. And so you wind up with this tautomerization reaction.
Right.
And it turns out that the keto form is the thermodynamically more stable form. So most of acetone, when it's dissolved in solution, will exist in the keto form. But spontaneously, if the conditions are right, if there's acid or base in the solution, it'll interconvert naturally to the enol form and wind up with an equilibrium between the two forms. Now, there are other types of tautomerization that exist beyond the keto-enol tautomerization.
So the tautomerization is just effectively you take the same elements,
right,
largely the same structure, but they're just, where the hydrogen bond, where the double bonds are, those move around within the molecule.
Right, yeah, they're interconvertible. And so we talked about the keto-enol form, but there's also other tautomers that have been discovered. We don't need to get into the specifics, but the lactam, lactim form, the amide, the imide form, the amine in the imine form. And so again, it's a very similar thing where a hydrogen is migrating from one function from one atom to the oxygen or the nitrogen, and then the double bond switches. So the chemistry is the same. Now, in DNA, there are these two different tautomeric forms. So for adenine and cytosine, there's an amino and an imino form. And then for guanine and thymine, it's the lactam and lactim form.
Right, okay.
And again, the amino and the lactam forms are the more stable. The lactam and the amino forms are less stable. But you get this interconversion taking place. It happens spontaneously. So at any one point in time, there is going to be a proportion of DNA in these different tautomeric forms. Now, the problem is that the amino and the lactam forms have different hydrogen bonding properties than the lactam and the amino forms. And that difference in hydrogen bonding means that an adenine will pair with a cytosine instead of with a thymine, and a guanine will pair with a thymine instead of a cytosine. And so when that happens during DNA replication, it'll actually lead to a misincorporation of the wrong base into the DNA strand, which leads to a substitution mutation.
Right, okay.
And so some DNA will spontaneously have mutations that are introduced, and some of the spontaneous mutations is attributable to these keto-eno tautomers. So some of it is unavoidable,
right? But
it's a real problem. Well, this guy Donald McDonald was interested in.
That's a great name.
It is, yeah. It was interested in, is there something unique about the selection of the nucleobases in DNA? Because one of the big questions in biochemistry is, why does DNA have the composition it has? Why is the backbone made up of phosphate and deoxyribose? Why are these 4 nucleobases chosen? In fact, in Fit for a Purpose, I have a whole chapter devoted to discussing why the structure of DNA is the way that it is. It's not haphazard. It actually has to be precisely the structure that it has for life to even be possible.
Okay.
And that there's not really alternatives to DNA that exist. But his question was really the why question. Why these 4 nucleobases? And in fact, he's published a number of papers exploring that why question, why these 4 nucleobases. And so he basically does these quantum mechanical calculations looking at these alternate tautomeric forms for adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. Then he does the same thing for imaginary DNAs that would be made up of other non-natural nucleobases. When we look at what would be potentially available in the prebiotic environment, there would be a whole host of other nucleobases that could have found their way into DNA. And what he discovered is that the 4 nucleobases in DNA are unique as a set in that they have that the tautomeric form that gives you appropriate hydrogen bonding is by far more stable than the tautomeric form that would cause mispairing. But for the other non-natural bases, that difference isn't as great. And so if other nucleobases would have been used in DNA, other than these 4, you'd have mispairing would be a much greater problem. Spontaneous mutations would be a much more severe problem. So he's suggesting that this is part of the rationale for why these nucleobases made it into DNA and other nucleobases didn't.
Okay.
Now, that in and of itself, you could say, well, number one, it's suggesting that the composition of DNA, at least with respect to the nucleobases, isn't just simply the outworking of historically contingent evolutionary processes, that there was some force that selected the components of DNA, at least the nucleobase components. So
that would be, there would be these things that would be going along, and this is the only one that worked to have a stable system that worked for a while.
So you could say, well, maybe this is reflecting natural selection at work, some kind of chemical version of natural selection. But what's interesting is Donald McDonald also did other studies where he showed that the 4 nucleobases in DNA are the only 4 that could be selected that would actually show a distortion in the double helix if mispairing took place. So this is a double optimization. It's not only optimized to minimize the effects of tautomerization, but if tautomerization happens and you get mispairing, these are the only 4 bases that will actually cause a distortion in the double helix. Now, why that is important is that distortion essentially allows the cell's machinery to recognize a mispairing has taken place, and there are mechanisms that can essentially excise out the wrong base and replace it with the correct base, or with the correct nucleotide.
Right.
On top of that, these 4 nucleobases also turn out to be the 4 that display the greatest degree of UV stability. That when when nucleobases absorb UV radiation, if the molecules can't irradiate away that radiation as heat, chemical bonds will break apart.
Right.
And so the 4 nucleobases have a structure that allows them to be flexible enough to absorb UV radiation and irradiate it away as heat.
Right.
And if it can't, the reactions that take place produce these compounds that again will cause a distortion of the double helix and are readily repairable. So to me, what moves us away from natural selection being the explanation to maybe a teleology or a design is the fact that you've got this triple coincidence.
Right.
It's one thing to say, hey, these 4 nucleobases are optimized for, minimizing the harmful effects of tautomerization. But then you would expect that maybe there should be other combinations of bases that might be better at causing a distortion in the double helix, or there might be other bases that would actually have greater UV stability, and that the structure of DNA from an evolutionary perspective should reflect kind of a competition of those three effects. The fact that these 4 nucleobases simultaneously have these 3 ideal properties that are all critical for DNA's role as a information storage molecule, where you want that information to have integrity and to be transmitted to the next, during DNA replication with a high degree of fidelity. The fact that these 4 nucleobases are just right, and you have this triple coincidence, either says we got really lucky, or that there was an intentionality to the structure of DNA.
Your description reminds me a lot of water. That people say, oh, you could have this liquid, that liquid, or the other liquid. And yet when you start looking at water, it's not that it just has gets a little bit less dense as its solid forms. It's also got a real high heat capacity. Right. It's also got once you start putting that all together, it's not like, oh, there's water in this other mix of materials. It's like there's water and then everything else. It sounds a lot like these nucleobases are there's this and everything else.
Right. And so to me, this is part of the evidence that suggests that DNA is designed.
Right.
Is that there's a rationale for why its compositional makeup is what it is. And in Fit for a Purpose, I talk about why phosphate, and why deoxyribose, and the fact that these are also unique components that give just right properties to DNA. So that optimality, that rationale suggests design. That's the type of feature you'd expect for design. But there's a type of anthropic principle at work here too, in that the composition of DNA, let's just limit it to the nucleobases, seems to be constrained by the laws of nature itself.
Right, yeah.
The laws of nature are responsible for the tautomerization. It's responsible for the pairing of the nucleobases. It's responsible for the UV stability, or the nature of the UV interactions with these nucleobases. Right. So the laws of nature are constraining, what are the requirements for DNA. But then it's eerie that the components that are in DNA have these just right properties, and that they are unique. Right. That this is the only set. So when you combine that, it suggests that there's a deep-seated teleology, that there is a mind that intentioned DNA to be exactly the way that it is.
Well, and it seems to extend beyond that, because those same laws that structure DNA to work that way are the same laws that drive the properties that water has. Right. Are the same laws that drive the properties that carbon has, which also are critical for the early universe, so that you produce a universe that has abundant hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. Right. So it's not just, oh, let's look at it in this. It's like you could change one of those. In fact, I've heard people say, well, you could tweak the laws of physics so that you'd still get abundant carbon in there or whatever. But you're now also affecting water and the
Right.
DNA molecules, and you're assuming that you're going to get something that all comes together and works as well. And
Right.
that seems to be a much bigger stretch than, oh, I've got this one thing. It's like there's this whole suite of things. It's a fascinating discovery.
Yeah. Well, and let's just explore that point a little bit more, because, when I wrote Fit for a Purpose, part of the premise of writing the book was where I make the case that there's a biochemical anthropic principle, is that there are two interpretations of the anthropic principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is there's a universe. We just happen to be in this lucky universe, some kind of non-theistic explanation. And part of my argument was that if indeed the anthropic principle is reflecting the work of a creator, then you would expect that it's not just the laws of physics and the constants of physics, but that when we go into chemistry, that there's the laws of chemistry, of course, are derived from the laws of physics, but they kind of form their own set of laws.
Right. Okay.
Right. And that we ought to see then also a biochemical anthropic principle where, again, the laws of biochemistry are derived from the laws of chemistry and the laws of physics, but they form their own, unique set as well.
Right.
And that if we see these anthropic coincidences stack up at these different regimes of complexity, it really suggests that there is a deep teleology to the whole shebang, that there's a right. It's one thing to have fine-tuning in the laws of physics, but then if you didn't see it in chemistry or in biochemistry, then you would say, well, maybe we just happen to be in the lucky universe. But there's something going on here that's highly suspicious, to your point.
And it really does constrain the idea that, well, you could tweak the laws of physics to solve this problem, but that has ramifications a lot of places. I think it speaks in some sense to the puddle analogy. Everybody's, puddle, it's like, wow, that's a unique form that just fits in there. There's this idea that whatever, water is going to adapt to whatever form. That's the way the physics is designed. There isn't a lot of capacity for life to adapt. There are a very stringent set of criteria that make it. So you can't have other kinds of life and then this one wins out and this is just what you get. It seems like this may be the only way you can do it. So there's only one shape for a puddle, and it's this very complex, elaborate shape.
Yeah. Well, the person who really is the father of anthropic reasoning isn't Brandon Carter, but it's actually Lawrence Henderson.
Okay, right.
And he was this physiologist at Harvard who in the early 1900s recognized what he called the fitness of the environment. And he noted that water and carbon dioxide and phosphates and the nature of organic compounds have these just right set of properties that create an environment that uniquely makes life possible.
Right.
And so his point was, if the environment wasn't the way that it was, life would never even exist. Evolution is only possible in a particular environment in the universe. And he argued that the coincidence, this can't just simply be coincidence, that all these things are lining up, that there has to be a deep-seated teleology to the universe that is creating an environment that even makes life possible, right? And so, in terms of the puddle analogy, drawing inspiration from Henderson, to me, it's like we're living in a universe where we actually have concave surfaces.
Right.
That it's it's not that so much the puddle adopts the shape of the hole. It's that we live in a universe where holes are even possible, right? That if things were different, it would be either a flat universe, not spatially, or it would be convex, but it wouldn't be concave.
So you just don't get puddles in the first place.
You just don't get puddles in the first place. So.
Well, that's fascinating. I love listening and learning. Biochemistry is much harder, but the complexity and the connections that it makes are compelling in a very real way. So.
Well, and I know we're trying to bring things to a close, but this idea, I mean, oftentimes what you see people do is say, look at the complexity of biochemistry. That level of complexity doesn't seem to have any rationale to it. Mm-hmm. It seems to be haphazard. This is the type of thing that, an unguided, historically contingent evolutionary process would produce. But then when we start asking the why question, what that ends up doing is exposing this deep-seated rationale for why things are the way they are, that it's not haphazard. There seems to be, again, an intentionality to it, which means at minimum it's not unguided, historically contingent processes, but that the way things look has been prescribed ahead of time by the very laws of nature. And then it's eerie that it's exactly the way it's supposed to be.
Agreed.
So,
well, thanks, Fuzz. I really appreciate that discussion. And just thank you for joining us today. Really had a fascinating discussion about DNA design and cognitive biases. Want to encourage you to join the discussion below in the comments. And remember to like this video and subscribe for more content. We drop a new episode of Stars, Cells, and God each Thursday. They're here available on YouTube and on your favorite app. And want to just remind you to share this video with a friend, and remember that the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe.